What most people misunderstand about empaths is this. They assume the issue is social skill, that somehow if an empath has few or no friends, it must be because they don't know how to connect. But that is not just inaccurate, it is backwards. Empaths do not lack connection skills. In fact, they often operate at a level of emotional perception that most people never reach. They read tone, micro-expressions, inconsistencies between words and feelings. They do not just hear what is said, they register what is meant, what is hidden, and what is avoided. And that level of awareness changes the entire social experience because once you see beneath the surface consistently, surface-level interaction starts to feel empty. Small talk is not just boring to an empath, it is disorienting. It feels like participating in something artificial, like everyone agreed to stay on the surface while pretending depth is not available. Conversations become predictable. Reactions feel rehearsed. Emotional sincerity is missing. And over time, this creates a quiet but persistent sense of disconnect. So, the empath faces a choice whether they consciously realize it or not. Do they keep engaging in interactions that feel shallow and misaligned just to maintain social volume, or do they step back and wait for something real? Most choose to step back, and that is where the misunderstanding begins. From the outside, it looks like withdrawal. It looks like isolation. But internally, it is not driven by fear. It is driven by discernment. Empaths are not looking for more conversations. They are looking for honest ones. They are not interested in being surrounded. They are interested in being understood. And once they realize how rare that is, their standards naturally rise. This is where the social circle starts to shrink. Not because people reject them, but because they quietly opt out of interactions that do not meet a certain level of authenticity. They stop forcing laughter. They stop pretending interest. They stop investing energy into dynamics that feel one-dimensional. And here's the part most people miss. This is not a loss. It is a filtration process. The empath is not becoming less social. They are becoming more precise, more intentional, more aligned with what actually fulfills them instead of what simply occupies their time. But there is a cost to that precision. Depth is rare. Genuine emotional presence is rare. People who are comfortable being seen clearly and who can see others clearly in return are not the majority. So, when an empath raises their threshold for connection, the number of people who can meet them there drops significantly. And they know that. They understand, often without putting it into words, that choosing depth means accepting solitude more often than others do. But to them, that trade-off makes sense, because being alone does not feel nearly as heavy as being surrounded by people who do not truly see you. So they become comfortable in that space, not because they do not value relationships, but because they value real ones too much to settle for anything less. And when you understand that, everything changes. The narrative shifts from, why do they not have more friends, to a much more accurate question, how many people are actually capable of meeting them at the level they live on? Because when someone is wired for depth, surface-level connection does not just feel insufficient, it feels dishonest. And most people would rather have company than truth. An empath would rather have truth than company. The next piece of this becomes even more practical and in many ways more misunderstood. When we say empaths absorb energy, it can sound abstract, almost mystical, but there is a very real psychological mechanism behind it. Empaths are highly attuned to emotional states, not just in a cognitive way, but in a physiological one. Their nervous system responds rapidly to the emotional cues of others. Tone shifts, tension in posture, subtle changes in breathing, these are not just observed, they are felt. And when you are around someone who is anxious, frustrated, manipulative, or emotionally chaotic, your body begins to mirror that state, whether you intend to or not. So over time, social interaction stops being neutral, it becomes costly. This is where the pattern starts to form. An empath spends time in a group, or even one-on-one, and walks away feeling drained. Not tired in the normal sense, but depleted, like something has been taken rather than exchanged. At first, they do not always understand why. They may assume it is just introversion or stress. But as the pattern repeats, the cause becomes clear. It is not the presence of people that drains them, it is the quality of emotional energy those people carry. And here is where it gets more precise. Most people regulate their internal state independently. An empath, on the other hand, often regulates in response to the environment. That means if they are surrounded by unresolved tension, they feel it. If they are around negativity, they process it. If someone is masking insecurity or anger, the empath picks up on the mismatch, and their system works to reconcile it. That is effort, constant, invisible effort. Now imagine doing that across multiple relationships, across days, weeks, years. Eventually, the empath reaches a point where their internal system starts to push back, not emotionally, but strategically. They begin to reduce exposure. They start declining invitations. They limit conversations. They become more selective about where they go, who they see, and how long they stay. Not because they have lost interest in people, but because they have recognized a pattern of energetic imbalance. This is where outsiders often misread the situation. It looks like withdrawal, avoidance, or even disinterest. But in reality, it is a form of calibration. The empath is learning to protect their baseline. Because once you become aware that certain environments consistently disrupt your internal state, continuing to expose yourself to them is not kindness, it is negligence. And empaths, especially after enough experience, stop neglecting themselves. They start asking different questions. Instead of, how do I maintain this relationship? It becomes, what does this interaction cost me? And is it worth it? That shift alone changes everything. And here's the critical point. Most people do not even measure relationships this way. They measure based on history, obligation, proximity. Empaths measure based on impact. How do I feel during this interaction? How do I feel after it? Is there mutual regulation, or am I the one constantly stabilizing the dynamic? When the answer becomes consistently one-sided, the empath does not argue, they adjust. This is why their circle gets smaller, but more stable. Fewer people, less chaos, fewer interactions, more clarity. They are not trying to maximize social contact. They are trying to optimize internal equilibrium. And once they experience what it feels like to be around someone who does not drain them, someone who is grounded, self-aware, emotionally consistent, the contrast becomes undeniable. It raises the standard permanently. At that point, tolerance for draining dynamics drops to near zero. So, what looks like distance is actually refinement. What looks like isolation is actually control. The empath is not retreating from people, they are eliminating unnecessary interference. Because when your internal state is constantly influenced by your environment, protecting that environment becomes essential. The truth is simple. If being around someone consistently leaves you feeling worse than you did before, that is not connection, that is consumption. If you follow this pattern far enough, you start to see a third factor emerge. And this one is less about wiring and more about experience. Because it is not just that empaths feel deeply or pick up on energy, it is that over time they learn what happens when those traits are placed in the wrong environments. Empaths tend to operate with a high degree of tolerance. They give people the benefit of the doubt. They rationalize behavior. They look for context, for underlying pain, for reasons that explain why someone acted the way they did. And in isolation, that is not a weakness, that is advanced social intelligence. But in the real world, that ability often gets misused. Because when you consistently understand people more than they understand themselves, you also become easier to overlook. Your boundaries become flexible, your patience becomes expected, and your willingness to stay, even when something feels off, creates an imbalance that others, consciously or not, learn to rely on. So, the empath gives more. They listen longer. They forgive faster. They carry emotional weight that was never assigned to them, but they pick it up anyway because they can. And for a while, it works. The relationship continues, the connection appears stable. But underneath that surface, there is a growing asymmetry that quietly drains the foundation of everything they are trying to build. One person is investing energy, while the other is simply consuming it. Now, this is where the dynamic shifts because eventually repetition creates clarity. The empath starts to notice patterns, not just isolated incidents, but consistent behaviors. They begin to see that certain people only show up when they need something, that apologies do not lead to actual change, and that their understanding is not being reciprocated. Instead, it is being depended upon. And this is a critical moment because at this point, the empath has gathered enough data to make a different decision. The real question is whether they will choose to act on it. Some do not, at least not immediately. They stay longer than they should, hoping that their insight will eventually lead to transformation in the other person. Over time, however, even that hope starts to erode. This does not happen because they have become cynical, but because they have become accurate. They finally realize that understanding someone does not obligate you to tolerate them. Once that distinction becomes crystal clear, their behavior changes very quickly. The empath stops over explaining themselves. They stop justifying other people's poor actions. They stop trying to manage outcomes that were never theirs to control in the first place. Most importantly, they stop giving at a level that is not being matched. This is often the exact moment when the people around them become confused because the empath, who was once always available, always patient, and always accommodating, suddenly is not. But what looks like a sudden personality change is actually just a healthy boundary correction. They have not become colder people. They have simply become more precise. They are no longer responding out of automatic habit. They are responding with clear intention. That single shift disrupts every dynamic that was built entirely on their previous overextension. Some relationships inevitably fall apart at this stage, not because the empath did anything wrong, but because the relationship was never balanced to begin with. It was only sustained by their willingness to carry more than their fair share. Once that willingness is finally removed, the whole structure collapses. This is why their circle often shrinks so dramatically, because when you stop overgiving, you also stop being compatible with people who are only benefiting from your generosity. As it turns out, there are more of those people around than most of us realize. Here is the part that matters most. This is not a traditional loss. It is a profound exposure. It reveals which connections were truly mutual and which ones were entirely conditional. For the empath, that hard-earned clarity is well worth the reduction in social volume, because once you have experienced what it feels like to be used, misunderstood, or emotionally depleted in a repeated pattern rather than just a passing moment, you simply do not unlearn that lesson. You integrate it deeply into who you are. You become much harder to manipulate, harder to access without genuine intention, and far more aware of where your energy is going and why. So when you happen to see an empath with very few people around them, understand that you are not looking at someone who failed to build relationships. You are looking at someone who learned through hard repetition which relationships were never real to begin with. The final conclusion they arrive at is simple, but it is certainly not easy. Empathy without solid boundaries is not true kindness. It is simply self-abandonment. If you take everything we have discussed so far, prioritizing depth over surface-level talk, maintaining a high sensitivity to energy, and absorbing the lessons learned through being overextended, it all leads to a final shift in priority. This is the exact moment where the empath fundamentally separates from the majority of people. At some point, they stop asking, "How do I maintain connection?" and start asking what kind of life actually feels right to live. That single question changes the entire framework, because most social behavior is driven by an unconscious need for validation. People stay in conversations they do not enjoy, maintain relationships that do not fulfill them, and stick around in environments that completely exhaust them, all just to maintain a sense of belonging. There is a silent trade being made here, trading authentic self-expression in exchange for social acceptance. Empaths eventually become fully aware of that trade, and more importantly, they start to reject it. They do not do this in a dramatic or confrontational way, but rather through a quiet, deliberate internal recalibration. They begin to notice that every single time they ignore their internal signals, and every time they tolerate noise, tension, or superficiality, their inner sense of peace deteriorates. Over time, that cost becomes far too obvious to ignore. So, they make a decision that most people go out of their way to avoid for as long as possible. They choose internal alignment over external approval. That is where their lifestyle starts to look noticeably different. They spend more time alone, but to them, it does not feel like deprivation at all. It feels like pure clarity. Without a constant stream of external input, their thoughts finally settle down. Their emotions stabilize. Their overall awareness sharpens. They are no longer adjusting themselves to match whatever room they walk into. They are now allowing the environment to reveal whether it actually matches them. That represents a complete reversal of control. Once that happens, the desperate need to be liked begins to lose its grip on them. This does not happen because they have grown indifferent to the world, but because they have experienced something far more valuable than mere approval. And that is coherence. It is the profound feeling that who they are on the inside is no longer in direct conflict with how they are living on the outside. That is a level of psychological consistency that most people rarely ever reach in a lifetime. From the outside looking in, this behavior can easily be misinterpreted. People may assume that the empath has simply become distant, detached, or even arrogant. But those kinds of interpretations usually come from individuals who are still operating entirely within the old approval-based framework. To them, choosing personal peace over active social participation just does not make sense. But to the empath, it is not even a question worth debating anymore because they have already tested the alternative. They have spent time in the crowded rooms, the endless draining conversations, and the relationships maintained out of sheer habit rather than true alignment. They have seen the final result of all that, which is only more noise, more confusion, and more internal conflict. So they decide to simplify their lives. They actively reduce unnecessary interaction. They become highly selective about who they allow into their personal space, not out of fear, but out of deep respect for their own mental and emotional state. They prioritize environments that feel genuinely calm, grounded, and authentic. In doing so, something very interesting happens. Their relationships, while fewer in number, become significantly more stable. There is a lot less performance, a lot less misunderstanding, and a lot less emotional volatility. The connections they do choose to maintain are based on mutual awareness rather than heavy social obligation. There is finally space for comfortable silence without awkwardness and total honesty without negative consequences. That is their new standard, and once that standard is firmly set, there is simply no incentive to ever go backward. The empath has realized something that most people spend years actively avoiding. Being surrounded by the wrong people is a far more subtle, yet far more damaging form of discomfort than simply being alone. One form of discomfort is obvious and temporary, while the other is constant and cumulative. So they choose their companions carefully, not with absolute perfection, but with conscious intent. That is the core distinction. Their life is no longer built around reacting to whatever social options happen to be available. It is built around responding only to what is genuinely aligned. Every single interaction, every relationship, and every environment is carefully filtered through one simple question. Does this contribute to my inner peace, or does it disrupt it? If it disrupts their peace, it simply does not stay in their life. That is the exact reason why their circle looks the way it does. It is not empty at all, it is carefully refined. Because in the end, the empath is not searching for a larger crowd of people. They are protecting something far more valuable than that. They are protecting their own state of mind. Once you truly understand the immense value of that peace, you stop chasing connection everywhere you go, and you finally start choosing it.